Chapter 6 King Neptune Comes Aboard. I heard the captain say to the mate, "We'd cross the line about 4 bells," said Mocker Moss to the assembled gang of the starboard watch cadets. "Will there be a bump?" asked Storm. There was a general laugh at this. "Who's been telling you ghost stories?" chirped Twitter Twynham. "Everybody knows there'll be no bump." "But there must be an edge or something," said the puzzled Storm. "Besides, I saw the carpenter looking through his telescope for the line. Somebody'd stuck a hair on the end of it, maybe," said a fellow who'd joined in New York. He was a fair-headed chap named Andy, very quiet and strong. "Well, anyway, I don't see how the two halves of the world can join together, and there isn't something there," said Storm, still somewhat bewildered. "Yes, and I suppose we'll start sailing downhill now, eh? Because we've come to the southern hemisphere," yelled Mocker. "Ha ha ha, is that all you learn in Ipswich? Something'll happen to you, Mocker, if nothing happens to the ship." Storm glared. The equator is an imaginary line about the circumference of the earth at its center, put in hard case with a show of learning that did not impress anybody very much. "'Maginary, what's that?" "Nothin'. You just think it's there, but it isn't there, you know, like you learn in school." "Well, I still think there ought to be a bump." "There might not have been any bump, but there was something that affected the boys more than that. Neptune came on board with all his court and all his ceremony, for he had to welcome not only a crowd of young fellows to his domains, but the ship herself. It was the first time the ship had been across the line. Neptune and his court came on board next day. The ship was more than a month out from New York. It was a Sunday, and she was sailing along slowly before a breeze, in which there was just weight enough to keep the canvas quiet. It had rained in the night, and all hands were washing clothes and yarning, as was the usual thing on quiet Sunday mornings in good weather. Suddenly there was a wild burst of music, mostly from a collection of empty kerosene tins beneath the forecastle head. A stentorian hail greeted the ship. "Ahoy there, Joseph Conrad." "Ahoy, Neptune," the captain replied. "Back your mainyards there, I'm coming on board." Whistles blew. The mainsail was hauled up loosely in its gear. Heavy yards were swung, and the ship lay rolling idly, with her backed mainsails balancing the full fore and mizzen, so that she was without way. Now the boys saw a strange party of old men and such coming up below the bow, in a battered dinghy that looked strangely like the ship's working pram, or would have looked like that if they'd thought to examine her. The boat came right up to the bows, and the occupants climbed on board. Stormalong saw there were some women amongst them, 2 women, one in a grass skirt that seemed to be made of wet seaweed, and another who was a nurse. What did they want a nurse for, he wondered. Neptune, resplendent in his white hair and golden crown, and his green robes, carrying a scepter that looked suspiciously like a disguised belaying pin, came first. After him came a seedy-looking gentleman in clerical robes, around whose chest was a board announcing that he was the dean of the Equatorial Cathedral. Behind him was the woman with the seaweed skirt, of which she had very little. Her large figure wobbled as she walked, which she did without much grace or distinction, and a degree of coyness not wholly called for. Then came a fierce-looking fellow in a great stovepipe hat and long-tailed frock coat, with bare feet, and a board on his chest announcing to the world that he was Dr. Sawbones, physician in extraordinary to H.M. King Neptune, and chief surgeon inquisitor of the South Sea. This worthy carried a sea-bag which was presumably full of his instruments. It clanked when he walked, and a length of hosing trailed on the deck out of it. With these were various dignitaries who would have been known as cops in New York, except that they had no boots, and some of their costumes looked rather amateurish. There was a fellow in whites carrying a bag of fearsome tools and a razor 3 feet long. He was labeled Barber, and he looked savagely about him at the boys as the court passed in solemn state along the main deck. One Davy Jones, who dripped sea-water and smelled of bilge water, the nurse, whose face was rouged with what looked like a mixture of red lead and mud, and the court musician, who played an old accordion with howling success, made up the party, headed by the dean, with King Neptune and his queen close behind. They walked along the deck to the captain, who was standing aft, and the 2 brass cannons on the poop were fired in salute as they came. Neptune seemed to get so great a shock that he nearly collapsed, but he quickly recovered himself when the queen dug him in the ribs with her umbrella. "All hail, Captain," said the king. "I welcome you again to my domains. What manner of ship is this you bring me now?" "Hail, King, it is a schoolship, so please your majesty, a schoolship with boys." "Ha, Captain, that sounds good to me," spoke the king. "And have these lads been in my domains before?" "No, King, we crave permission for ship and people to proceed. There'll be a court on that," said the king. "Come on, court, to business." At that the dean began to read a long speech from a scroll that looked like a roll of wallpaper, and 3 hours later he was still reading the same speech, or from the same scroll anyway, but nobody listened. In the meantime, King Neptune asked for a list of the boys who had not been across the line before, and when he saw how long it was, he smiled a grim smile, and the doctor rolled up his sleeves, danced a jig on the deck. He opened up his bag of instruments, and when they saw a rusty saw fall out, Stormalong and Mocker made a dash for the rigging, but Neptune's cops were too smart for them. Up after them they flew, and there was a merry chase with the barber. Far below compounded a mixture of hogwash, lamp black soft soap, and bilge water. Storm tore to the mizzen crosstrees, and then, seeing a cop in full pursuit, waving a truncheon close behind him, swung for the top-gallant stay, and slid furiously to the main top. Here Mocker had already run, and there was another policeman there. He scampered up the topmast, rigging with a wild haste, and the panting of the cop behind shook the mast. Over the cross trees he flew, and up to the truck, where he perched on the radio yard. The cop was big and fat, and maybe he couldn't get up there. Storm looked down, grinning, and the grin vanished like magic from his face. There was the cop within 3 feet of him. He had time only to jump for the royal stay, and slid down to the 4 cross trees, and he could tell from the sagging of the stay that the cop was close behind him. Up he scampered again, like a monkey in the rigging, and far below he could see others of the court running along the deck to the forecastle head to catch him when he came down. Up to the fore-truck he climbed with amazing speed, but there was no safety. There was the cop after him again, and he could see Mocker kicking and struggling furiously, being carried down the main mast by Davy Jones and another of the policemen. From the fore-truck at the very top of the foremast, Storm jumped for the royal stay, and slid down until his hands burned, and he could feel the skin peeling from them. Down, down he slid towards the jib boom end. Halfway down he thought the best plan would be to stop up there. Since he got down to the jib boom, there was nowhere to go but the ocean or the deck. In the ocean, from that height, he could see some big hungry sharks flitting here and there, and he shuddered at the thought of making a meal for them. "Look out, Stormy," came a hail from the deck. "Look out, Storm, behind you now." He glanced around, half fearful of seeing a shark leaping up there 100 feet above the sea. He was almost relieved to see it was only a cop. Down he swung again, with the iron stay searing his hands, out on the boom. Far below him he could see the barber waiting for him. Well, he wasn't caught yet. When he was still about 30 feet above the boom, he leapt for the next stay, the fore-topgallant stay, and began to climb up that. At that a cheer rose from the deck. This was a good chase. Good old Storm was giving the cops some exercise. Hand over hand he climbed up, pausing for breath halfway, where he swung and rolled with the ships rolling. There he had a chance to rest a while, for none of the cops would climb up the stay, but it was only a matter of minutes before one of them had mounted to the 4 cross trees, and from there he was coming down the stay, cutting off Storm's retreat. Stormalong was desperate. He slid a few feet down, swung to the jib stay, slid down that, swung to the fore stay like a monkey, and almost ran up that, the short height to the foreyard. Out along the yard he ran to the braces. The yard was braced sharp, and the main yard aback was not far away. Hand over hand he made his way along the lee brace until he reached the main yard, and running in along that, for the ship was almost still. Momentarily he leapt for the top, and scampered up the topmast rigging. "Come on, Stormy!" rose the shouts. The other victims were so interested in the chase that they forgot for the moment what was to happen to themselves. Storm reached the main truck at the head of the main mast with an amazing speed, and paused for breath. He knew that sooner or later he must be caught, but the latter the better. He began to wonder about a plan of campaign, but it was tough. There were too many after him. He could from there only slide down the royal stay to the foremast, or swing into the back stays and go down on the deck. A great puffing and grunting in the crossed trees told him the cops were already hot on his trail. He looked forward. One of them was waiting by the 4 cross trees. No use, then, to go there. But there was still one thing he could do. He grasped the lee backstay and slid down that, but instead of going right to the deck, he stopped by the crojack yard, and ran along the stout brace there to that yard. Then he was in the mizzen mast, and no one for the moment was there to stop him. He ran out along the gaff, and sat on the chain outhaul by the gaff end, and there defied any and all cops to come out and get him. But it was a losing fight. He had to come down, sooner or later. He could watch the fearsome preparations on the deck. Neptune's court, all hands were waiting for him. The barber, down on deck again, was stropping his horrible razor. Even in the rigging he could smell the foul concoction of his lather, and every minute the callous wretch was adding some ingredient even more horrible to his foul brew. The doctor, too, had emptied his medicines on the after skylight, and was practicing on his stomach pump. Gosh, thought Storm, they'll get me sooner or later. Maybe I better go now before they get too mad. Maybe they'll think up even worse things if I stay here and make it harder. The approach of a big cop along the gaff hastened his decision. He dropped from the peak and slid by one of the vangs down to the deck. "All right, King," he said. "I'm here. I'm sorry I ran away." "You'll be sorrier," snapped the king. "Drown the brat," shrilled his ugly wife. Storm would have liked to drown her. "Shave him," yelled the barber. "Physic him," yelled the doctor. "He's awful sick." "Pull his teeth out," said the nurse. "Well, he's got to be examined first," said the doctor, with a wicked leer, as he grabbed the boy and began at once to pound and pummel and thump him all over. "No bones loose," he went on. "No, but by gosh, there soon will be," thought Storm. "The boy seems in sound health. Ha, what's this? Insomnia, hey, can't sleep, can't eat." Storm opened his mouth to deny these false charges, but the instant he did, the nurse threw in a mouthful of the foulest medicine he had ever tasted in his life, a concoction that, from the miserable taste of it, must have been a compound of castor oil, Epsom salts, extract of curry, cabbage water, cod liver oil, blackjack, and boiled barnacles. "Ugh," he spluttered, and the nurse ladled in some more. The initiation was in progress. He was physicked half a dozen times, lathered and shaved with the 3-foot razor, made to bow and kiss Neptune's feet and his wife's hand, which she had decorated with some fish scales and fresh paint, and then thrown in a big tub of water. That done, a large OK was painted in red letters on his back, and the doctor shouted in a loud voice for the next victim. That was Mocker, and Storm grinned with delight. It was good fun once your own turn was over. Mocker kicked and struggled and had an even worse time, and then Twitter came, but Twitter had learned something and was quiet for once. Then all the rest were done, one after the other, and some of the court's finery began to come adrift, and Storm suspected they were members of the crew, had been all the time. Neptune, curiously enough, was about the build of Chips, the carpenter, who was missing. His wife was about the build and temper of Slobber the cook. The nurse, for all her rouge and once white dress, looked strangely like young Hilgard from the Parma. Ho, thought Storm, so they've put something over on me. Well, I'll get even. In the evening, with the ship in the southern hemisphere and the sails full of the new trade wind, all hands were given raisin cake and grog, and with the initiation behind them, the boys sang happily and were pleased. But Twitter and Storm and the rest of them looked forward to shipping some new fellows in Africa or Australia and putting them through something of what they had experienced. Chapter 7. A Strange Visit. "It's Brazil, I reckon." "Huh, you reckon? Have you told the captain yet?" "It's Argentine, or some place." "Well, it ain't blooming Ipswich anyhow, and that's something to be thankful for." Needless to say, the utterer of the last sentiments was Twitter Twynham, and needless to add, Hardcase had something to say about it. So did Storm. The boys were looking at a low, sandy coastline about 3 miles off, with, far beyond, high blue mountains in a long range that stretched as far as they could see. The land was on the starboard beam. Nearby, some small boats of a curious type were fishing. It was a week since they had crossed the line, and Rio de Janeiro, the next port of call, was still more than 1,000 miles away. They had changed sail in the morning, and now it was watch below. It was almost calm, and the ship had very little headway. At 4 bells, the mate blew 2 whistles, the summons for his watch, and swung out the dinghy aft. The captain had decided to pull around to the small fishermen. Close by to buy some fish for a meal of fresh food for all hands. It was more than 6 weeks since they had tasted fresh food. Storm and Hardcase, with Hilgard and Carl, were appointed to be the crew of the boat. The boys jumped in with alacrity and great grins, but they did not grin quite so much after they had pulled 3 miles, and the captain decided that since the beach was so close, they might as well go in and land. However, they still had something of a grin. How lovely the old ship looked as they pulled away. She looked much lovelier with Mocker and Twitter and all those fellows enviously lining the rail. Mocker said he could have pulled the boat himself better than the 4 of them. And as for Twitter, he was of the frequently expressed opinion that anybody from Yorkshire could do anything on earth better than everybody else on earth without trying. There was a line of big breakers running near the shore, and it looked quite dangerous to go in. The great swell of the Atlantic Ocean, though it had looked nothing from the ship, became quite huge and dangerous as it met the opposition of the land. The dinghy bobbed about and slid up and down, but the boys kept on rowing. The captain saw a place where he thought he could get through. "Now, boys, heartily, pull all," he shouted. "Get some way on her." The dinghy seemed very small in the big combers, but she had a graceful seat in the water, and the boys, with their backs to the land, could not see the bigger breaking seas, but they could hear them very well. "Handsomely now, put your backs into it, my lads." The little boat spun along. Now she was right on the crest of a big sea which, if it broke, would certainly have swamped her and drowned all hands. Even if it did not drown them, how could they get back to the ship if they were cast up on the beach without their boat? Castaways, that was what they would be, but Stormalong did not have time to think of that, or he might have looked forward to such a fate. It was a mighty nice-looking beach. The boat spun on. Now she was on top of another swirling sea that licked at the gunwales, and seemed as if it wanted to overthrow her, but it did not. On top of the sea they could see the beach, and when that sea had passed, they were beyond the bar, and the sand of the bottom glinted through. Now the water was smooth inside the breakers, and in a few seconds the dinghy grounded. "Jump, my lads, haul the dinghy up and let us forage," the captain ordered. "You boys keep together. I will ask for permission to climb for coconuts." Some big coconut palms grew almost to the water's edge, and high up where their frond-like branches clustered the boys could see great knobs of the luscious nuts. Storm was all for climbing up at once, without waiting for anything so dull as permission. Indeed, it seemed for a while that they would not be given this, for the simple reason that there was nobody awake to ask. The beach was lined with a few rough hovels, most of them built of mud, and in front of them, in the shade, lay 3 or 4 men sleeping. Nobody else was to be seen in the place. At length, however, they found a small store, very decrepit and poorly stocked, and though the proprietor, whose color was a curious mixture between black and a kind of dark white, spoke no word of any language they knew, they obtained permission from him to climb one of the village trees for some nuts. The ship, in the meantime, had drifted off and was about 7 miles away. She looked very small from that distance, and Stormalong began to wonder what would happen to them if she dropped out of sight. Not that the captain seemed to be worried much, though he examined the sky frequently, evidently with satisfaction. They did not stay long ashore in such a dull place. Nobody woke up except the storekeeper, and he had nothing to sell, only tinned things, and firecrackers and the like. The boys got some coconuts, but they were not good, and then they launched the dinghy again and were off. Going out through the breakers was more fun than going in had been, and the dinghy was almost rolled over twice, but they made it, although they were all wet to the skin, and they began to long row back to the ship cheerfully. On the way they spoke two of the fishermen, and Stormalong saw that their boats were the strangest things he had ever seen under sail. They were nothing but 4 or 5 small logs, lashed roughly together in the shape of a boat, floating on the surface, with a light, big sail set from a pliant stick that could be shifted at will. They carried nothing but a water jar, some fish, and 2 barefooted, grinning natives, who laughed heartily at the idea of being given tobacco and things in exchange for some of the fish. The dinghy was absent about 5 hours before it returned, laden with fish. No sooner had they come back than several of the fishermen came over, offering more fish. Mocker sent down a parcel of cigarettes to one of them, who promptly made off without giving poor Mocker anything. The boys laughed. The fishermen laughed, too, when he was out of range, but Mocker had a great deal to say, none of which was very complimentary. In the evening a breeze came, and the ship ghosted on. This was interesting sailing, with a coastline in sight. Sometimes big steamers went close by, and sometimes they saw native sailing craft. The sun shone, and the land was interesting, and all in all, not even Twitter missed Yorkshire very much under those conditions. At length the ship came to Rio de Janeiro, the chief town of Brazil. The boys found it interesting going for rides on the harbor in the dinghy and the lifeboats, and trips around the city and the neighboring hills by streetcar and in good-natured friends' motor cars. "I like this place," quoth Storm, on the third night in, but I wish the people would speak English. All people should be made to speak English, said Twitter, who spoke that language very badly, and had not a word of anything else. What's wrong with American? Asked Andy. Well, that'd do too, allowed Hardcase, but English is better. American's a bit hard to understand. Gosh, said Storm, I even shouted awful slow to a fellow in a tram today, and he didn't understand me. You waste your voice on some people. What do they speak here anyway? Mocker wanted to know, but nobody could answer him. However, they were all agreed that English should be spoken, but they enjoyed the tramps ashore nonetheless for the difficulty in making themselves understood, and after all, whenever they were hungry, which was fairly often, they had no difficulty, at least, in making that understood. They climbed the city's surrounding hills, and one day made a trip by cable car to the top of the Sugarloaf, at the entrance to the harbor. Here even Mocker had nothing to say, for quite 3 minutes. The sight was so beautiful, but he made up for this temporary silence afterwards. A suspension car on a stout wire cable took them to the mountain top, and from there they could look down over all Rio and the lovely harbor, and away in the distance the blue mountains of Brazil. Even Twitter forgot to mention, for the moment, the infinite superiority of Yorkshire, but Hardcase, on the way down, spoke about a gasometer they had back in Ipswich that was higher, so he said, than the Sugarloaf, and according to Stormalong, the view from up there was even better. One of these days, said Slobber, the cook who was with the party uninvited, somebody'll believe something you boys say, then you'll faint of the shock. Well, nobody'll ever believe anything you say, rejoined Stormalong. Yous boys are too cheeky, that's what I say, protested Slobber. You get away with too much, that's what I say. What do you do all the time? Eat and sleep, and that's all. If I was captain, things'd be different. Yes, said Mocker, there'd be difference, all right. Instead of us being up here on the mountain, the ship would be. Ha ha ha. When I was captain of the Whale of Ipswich, began Slobber, but the boys, who had heard all that 7,000 times before, and they made so many catcalls and rude noises that everybody else in the car turned round to look, and Slobber, with a low growl and a threat of putting salts in the tea, had to subside. Slobber really had been captain of the Whale of Ipswich. He'd been cook, engineer, deckhand, chief mate, and cabin boy too. Indeed, he was the owner, the captain, and the sole crew, for the Whale was a wheezy old sand barge about 30 feet long that used to climb up on a sandbank at high tide, fill herself up with Slobber's help with the sand at low tide, and crawl off again any time in the future that she would float. The boys knew the Whale of Ipswich very well. One day Slobber put her up on a bank, and by some mistake the tide never came back for her any more, and the sand-laden whale lay there waiting while slobber sailed round the world. After a happy week in Rio, the ship sailed. It was a Saturday morning when she went out. She could have gone the previous day, but that was a Friday, and the captain would not sail on Fridays. When the boys asked the older sailors why this was, so they were told it was bad luck, but there seemed no other explanation. It seemed to Stormalong that fellows who stayed too long in sailing ships became very superstitious. Not that he minded, for the longer they stayed in ports, the more fresh food was there to eat. Chapter 8. Tough Guys. "I'll bet I'm the toughest feller in this ship, I'll bet," said Hardcase in a loud voice, proudly exhibiting one very ginger hair on his white chest, one morning about 2 weeks out from Rio. "Yes, you're tough, all right," said Mocker. "You're plenty tough in the head. Ha ha ha." Fellers that laugh at their own jokes are weak in the head, that's what they are, said Storm with scorn. "Did he make a joke?" asked Twitter very solemnly. "His face is the best joke I've seen in a long time. Ha ha ha." "I wish we had something for breakfast besides curry and rice," put in Storm, mournfully disregarding the fact that he had eaten 4 plates of the dish, and 8 pieces of toast besides. "Can you eat albatrosses, Twitter?" "I dunno. Ask that tough guy over there, him with the hairy chest. Can you eat albatrosses, Jim?" "I dunno. I reckon I could eat one with all the feathers on just now." "Well, you must be tough then." "Course I'm tough. Want to see something, you fellers? Want to see what a real strong man can do. Where is he? Me, of course. Ho ho ho. Well, bring me a nail then, and I'll bang it right through this mess table here with my hands." "Gosh, Jim, can you do that?" asked Storm in an odd voice. "You bet I can, with one sock." "Why, it's nothing." Mocker brought a twisted, rusty nail out of the carpenter's shop. It was the breakfast half-hour, between 8 bells and 1 bell of the forenoon watch, and the carpenter was temporarily away. Hardcase, with a great show of strength, and some mumbo-jumbo of examining the grain of the deal table, and such stuff, took the nail in one hand, placed it carefully on the table with its sharp end down, and with one mighty blow with the flat of his palm struck the nail right through the inch of wood. "Well, I'm blowed," said Mocker. "Hey, there was a hole in the table before." "There was not," exclaimed Hardcase indignantly. "Here, bring me another nail, I'll do it again." This time, with some muttered incantations over the nail, just for the sake of the effect, he carefully chose a place where there was not even a mark on the table, held the nail, the nail with the one hand, and belted it with the open palm of the other. Again the nail seemed to slide right through the wood, coming out the other side. Even Twitter was aghast with admiration. He examined Hardcase's palm, examined the nail, thoroughly investigated the table. There was no mark on the boy's palm, and the nail had certainly gone through the table. Mocker searched Hardcase all over to see if he had some hidden implement, a piece of metal or something that he had slid in his palm, but there was nothing. It was genuine. It certainly was genuine. It was a clean, neat trick. Hardcase had been the whole voyage learning it from the carpenter. You just chose a place in the deal, which was pretty soft, straight-grained wood between the grain, and one hard blow of the open palm, and on a nail-head, provided you did it right, would strike the nail through and not hurt your hand. You had to have confidence, that was all. If you got to thinking about how your palm would be hurt, why, it would be hurt for sure. There's something funny about it, said Mocker, after thorough examination. Well, you can try it if you're tough enough, said Hardcase. And how about that Yorkshire feller over there? Don't tell me an Ipswich chap can do something he can't do. You bet he can, said Storm. I always knew you were very tough, Jim, but I didn't know you were as tough as that. Storm was appropriately odd. Mocker and Twitter could be seen all day going around trying to bang nails into pieces of wood with their hands, but all that happened was that Twitter banged a nail through his palm, and Mocker was growled at by the mate for wasting good timber, so he was given the lavatories to clean out for a week in his morning watch. The weather was cold again by then. The tropic zone had been left far behind, and the little ship was running before strong winds toward the Cape of Good Hope. The wind was mostly from the westward, blowing fresh, and big albatrosses flew astern all day. The weather was often thick with rain squalls, and there was lookout on the forecastle head day and night. The ship was under short canvas, and the steering was hard, so hard that Mocker had been sent from the wheel once for making the ship swing too wildly. Stormalong and Hardcase were good helmsmen, and they kept their turns. It was a matter of pride with the boys to do their best at the wheel, to be the first in all the lighter work aloft. Sometimes at easy jobs on deck they loafed a bit, when they were making sennet and robons and such things beneath the forecastle head, out of the rain. Everybody knew such jobs were only to keep them occupied, and they were allowed to talk and yarn. The mates were good chaps when you got to know them. They helped the boys all they could, and taught them the finer points of practical seamanship. Chips and Sails and Carl the boatswain, and Jan the topman, and Hilgard and Frank were all good eggs. Pete, the second mate, who had the starboard watch, was admired even by Twitter, though Pete suffered the frightful disadvantage of never even having seen Yorkshire. The chief mate the boys called Bufter because they couldn't pronounce his real name, and he buffed about a lot anyway. He growled a lot and nothing ever seemed to satisfy him, not even the wind, but he knew his work, and his watch respected him. Nobody in ships ever likes chief mates. It isn't natural. The worst job the boys had was taking turns, week about in the bad weather, helping Slobber bringing up coal to the galley, and such things. That was a job they all hated, but you could have fun with old Slobber, and you could get cookies out of him too, if you worked him right. All you had to say when the weather was really bad was something about how a big ship like the Whale would be comfortable in that sea, or how he must have been through much worse storms in the Whale, or at any rate something complimentary about that lugubrious craft. Slobber always perked up at that, and even gave Mocker doughnuts. One day Twitter said Yorkshire would be a real good place if only they had ships up there like the Whale, and he got half an apple pie. Being at sea, all things considered, wasn't such a bad life. All you fellers keep good lookout for islands tonight, said Pete to his watch at midnight, muster on the 19th day from Rio. It was a misty, rainy, and blowing so hard there was a reef in the three topsails. "What islands are around here, sir?" asked Storm. "Tristan da Cunha is close by, and we have to keep good lookout for it," the second mate replied. "It is a high island, but it's mostly covered with clouds, so you keep good watch, Storm." "That I will, sir." It was daybreak, though before they saw the land, and then it was quite close. It was a high, bleak island, the top of which was covered with heavy cloud. A big sea broke against the rocks, and from the ship they could hear the dull, heavy thunder of the surf. They were sending up the fore royal yard when they saw the land. "Ugh, it looks a gloomy hole," said Hardcase. "Peoples lives there," said Chips, who was hanging over the rail in the breakfast hour, looking at the land. "What kind of people, Chips?" asked Mocker. "English peoples. Maybe you'll see 'em by and by. Maybe dey come out. Dey always comes out when dey sees ships." "Have you ever been ashore there, Chips?" "Ja, I been there once times, that's snuff." "Tell us about the people, Chips. Do you reckon they'll come out to us, do you?" "Not if dey's knows you are on board," said Chips. "Better yous boys shut up now, do some works. By and by, de peoples come." And nothing could be got out of Chips. His prophecy was quite correct. The islanders came out to the ship, pulling two long boats very ably in the big sea. It was raining and cold, but they did not seem to mind. Stormalong and his pals were excited. "Gosh, they speak English," yelled Twitter as the boats came close, and a gentleman in clergyman's dress hopped nimbly on board. "Blimey, a sky pilot," said Slobber as he nipped back into the galley. With the clergyman, who was speaking to the captain animatedly, came another fellow, attired roughly in an old suit, who began at once to speak to all hands. asking for tobacco. The boys crowded round, talking excitedly, asking him all sorts of questions at once. This chap said he was the chief of the island, but in all truth he did not look much of a chief to Storm. The ship, with her mainyards backed to take the way from her, was rolling quietly and dipping slowly in the sea. The small boats in which the islanders had come out were jumping about far more, but to everybody's great surprise, the chief became at once violently seasick in the scuppers. "Gosh," said Storm, "that's funny. How can he row in a little boat all right and then get sick in a big one?" "It's different motions," Chips explained. "Just the same, you go in is boat from this one, you get sick. E come in this ship from his boat, e get sick. Just the same with the albatross. E fly, e swim, e no get sick. By and by, you catch 'em bring 'em on board, ere is sick." "What, an albatross get sick? No. You think I tell lie. Course he get sick, just the same this feller." "Well, we'll have to catch one and see," said Storm, still dubious. "Mr. Chief, have you got any curios on your island?" This to the seasick chief, who still gulped unhappily in the scuppers. The chief mumbled something incoherently in reply, something to the effect, as far as Stormalong could gather, that there weren't any, not since the last tourist had passed by. "Mr. Chief, have you got any old stones, like, and strange things on your island? Is there any good place to play? What do the boys do all day long? Do you have school? Is there church on Sundays? Do you catch many fish? Is it always raining? What do you live on? Do you see many ships?" And so on, and so on. Poor Chief, he muttered feebly to himself, and kept on asking for tobacco, and throwing frenzied glances over the side to see if the boats were coming back to take him off again, and looking vainly down the saloon companion for the reappearance of the cleric, who had gone down there with the captain. All hands busied themselves collecting books and magazines and gramophone records and an old gramophone and blankets and bags of flour and whatever else they imagined might be of use to the islanders. And then the chief, still asking feebly for tobacco, hailed his boat again, and all these things were passed on board. Then the chief, with greater alacrity than he had shown for some time, climbed up on the rail, hopped onto the channels, and, as his boat rose on the crest of a sea, jumped back onto the thwarts. Then at once he was recovered from his seasickness, though his boat bobbed about horribly. "Blowed, if I understand it," said Mocker Moss. "There's lots of things you don't understand, for instance." But the rest of these uncomplimentary observations were cut short by the shout of "Weather main brace! Stand by to wear ship!" The ship was close in on the shore, and the boys could see the high walls of forbidding rock. The wind was off the land. However, there was no danger. Stormalong shivered as he thought what a wretched place. Tristan would be to spend the rest of his life. He could see some people standing solemnly on the beach, waiting for the return of the boats. The parson had gone off, too. The ship was put about, and headed out to sea. The captain dipped the ensign in farewell to the islanders, who cheered, and the boys cheered in reply. But in truth, Stormalong at least cheered lustily, more at the thought of not having to stay in such a place, for it was gloomy and bleak, and it looked melancholy and sad. It blew fresh that night from the west, and for the following week the wind was a moderate gale from southwest. At the end of that time they saw before them, late one night, the reflection in the sky of the lights of Cape Town, still 50 miles away, and a month out from Rio de Janeiro. The little ship docked in the Table Bay docks.